much. So hi, everybody. Yeah, thanks so much for joining us. I'm Steve Goodwin. I'm a member of the ASHA board and the facilitator for today's webinar that we're really looking forward to with Brittany, Chen, and Kate Holmes. So the American School Health Association is an awesome organization, and its mission is to transform all schools into places where every student learns and thrives. And the American School Health Association envisions healthy students who learn and achieve in safe and healthy environments, nurtured by caring adults functioning within coordinated school health and community support systems. And there are many benefits to joining ASHA. I hope that if you are not a member, you will consider becoming one, because you have access to the Journal of School Health, which is really it's a fun journal. Every time you get it, there's at least one article that you're definitely going to enjoy reading and get into. Continuing education opportunities for, you can get a lot of free continuing education through journal work, through attending the webinars, through the annual conference, etc. They also have a lot of discounts, selected AAP publications, discount on the Sex Ed Network, job postings, etc. And there is also, it's a great organization. I know just from attending the conferences for all the years that I have, I've been able to develop a cadre of friends who, if I have professional questions, I can contact them, access. Everybody is very willing to step up and provide any assistance you need. So there are a great many benefits to joining. And we have our virtual conference coming up. Obviously, this is usually in person, but with COVID, it is now virtual, September 30th and October 1st. And our two keynote speakers are going to be Dr. Lori DeSaltz and Dr. Kenneth Ginsberg. And they are both really awesome. And they're worth the price of admission anyway. So I hope that if you have not registered for the conference, you will certainly consider doing that. But today, we are fortunate to have our presenters, Brittany Chen and Kate Holmes. Brittany Chen has extensive expertise in policy research and analysis, stakeholder engagement, community mobilization, youth development. She engages diverse sectors to collaborate for population health improvement through research and assessment efforts. She has also championed tobacco prevention throughout New England, mobilizing youth and adults to advocate for policy, systems, and environmental change to make communities more tobacco-free. Kate Holmes is responsible for providing training, technical assistance and support to CDC-funded state education agencies in targeted school districts to address environments supportive of physical education and physical activity. Prior to joining NNPHI, she worked closely with early care and education sites, schools, school districts, and state-level partners to provide technical assistance and professional development on strategies to increase physical activity and improve nutrition environment. So with that, whoops, didn't mean to hit that one. So with that, I'm going to stop my share and we're going to turn it over to Brittany and Kate and enjoy the session.
Steve, thank you so much for that warm welcome. And I want to second everything Steve said about how wonderful ASHA is. I've been a member for many years, always enjoy their conference, and we'll be joining the conference next week. So welcome everyone. Today, Brittany and I will be presenting on engaging youth in a comprehensive youth physical activity program. We're really excited to talk a little bit more about this and encourage you to ask questions throughout and just engage as much as you can. Next slide. I want to give a special thanks to our funders. We are funded through a cooperative agreement with CDC. They're very supportive of our work, and we are always incredibly grateful to them. Next slide. So Steve did a wonderful introduction, but Brittany and I also just wanted to have a chance to say hi and say a little bit about ourselves. So my name is Kate Holmes. I work for the National Network of Public Health Institutes, And along with Health Resources in Action, we run an initiative called Springboard to Active Schools, which is focused on improving physical education and physical activity in schools around the country. I am the co-director for that project and a program manager at NNPHI. This work, I've been doing work in schools for a while now, and I think physical education and physical activity is so important. I know I always feel so much better after I have a chance to get up and move, and we know that that's the same for students in school, especially right now during the time of COVID-19. So it's something I'm just incredibly passionate about. I'm going to pass it over to Brittany to say hi as well.
Hi, everyone. My name is Brittany Chen. I am the Managing Director of Health Equity at Health Resources in Action. And as Kate said, I'm also a co-director of Springboard to Active Schools. And so glad to be with you all today to talk about youth engagement in a comprehensive school physical activity program. And youth engagement is a passion of mine. I've worked with young people, as Steve said, in tobacco prevention and nutrition, changing the nutrition environment. And I see so many tremendous opportunities in the physical education and physical activity space in schools to engage youth leadership, really lift up youth voice. And so I'm excited to talk with you all today about some practical ideas as well as kind of the conceptual benefits of doing this work together. So thanks so much. Look forward to the conversation.
Thanks, Brittany. Next slide. So if you've ever been in a webinar or training with us, which I see a few familiar faces, Brittany and I love to keep things as interactive as possible. And now that we know that most of us have been working from home and getting very familiar with Zoom over the last few months, again, we just like to make sure that things stay really interactive. But I did just want to do a quick overview of some of the tools we're going to be using today. So first of all, we encourage you throughout, both when we prompt you to and if you have a question, to use the chat box. Feel free to share comments, questions, and again, there'll be a few times throughout the session that we'll actually prompt you to use the chat box. Another tool I want to be sure to call your attention to is the Annotate tool. So if you look at the top of your screen, you might kind of have to hover your mouse up at the top. There should be a drop-down menu that says View Options. And if you click on the Annotate button, you're going to see a toolbar come up. And Brittany, you can go to the next slide, actually. So this is the Annotate toolbar that's going to come up, and we're going to use two things in particular today. We're going to use Stamp and Test. So if you click on that stamp, you have a couple of different options of stamps you can use. You can use a heart, a star, a check mark, whatever you want to use. We're going to prompt you to stamp your mark on the screen a few times during today's session. Another button we want you to be familiar with is the text button. And again, there might be an opportunity in just a few minutes where you'll have to write something on the screen. And all you'll do is you'll write something in the text box, and then when you click away, everyone is going to be able to see it. So I'll be sure to prompt you again to know where this is, but we'll be using it throughout today's session. And in fact, Brittany, if you'll go to the next slide, we will practice using it right now. So what I want you to do is take a moment and think back to when you were in high school. And on a scale from 1 to 5, how engaged were you in the decisions that shaped your school or school experience? So again, go up to that View Options toolbar and press Annotate, and then take a stamp. I see lots of stars showing up. You can take that stamp and put your stamp near where, on a scale from 1 to 5, how engaged you were in the decisions that shaped your school or school experience. And I'll actually do this as well. I'm going to put mine right near that 4. Okay, seeing lots of good answers come through. Okay, so some folks who maybe were not at all engaged. Lots of people who were maybe 2s, 3s, 4s. No one was very engaged, which is very interesting to me. So yeah, it looks like we have a big range of folks in terms of how engaged they were in their students, in their school experience. Great. Okay, Brittany, do you mind clearing this and moving to the next slide? Okay, so again, embody your high school self. And on a scale from 1 to 5, how engaged were you in the decisions that shaped your school experience specific to physical education and physical activity? So again, think back to high school, go back to that Annotate bar and grab a stamp. And how engaged were you? I'm going to do this too. And for me, I would have said not at all engaged. But I'm interested to see what other folks are saying. Okay. So a lot of people around 1 or 2. For people who put 3 or 4, please, I would love to hear from you in the chat box about how you were engaged. I think my hypothesis before we did this was that everyone was going to click 1. So I'm really interested in folks who put 3 or 4. So how engaged were you? So if you wouldn't mind adding that to the chat box, I would love to hear that. Okay, thanks everyone. So again, if you selected 3 or 4, please add to the chat box about how you were engaged, because that's wonderful. I'm so glad to hear that. And we'll talk more about why that's so important for you to be engaged in PE and PA. So Candace shared that she was an athlete, and so she was able to skip certain activities if it risked injury. That's awesome. Athletics, lots of different comments about being able to pick your different sports or activities each quarter. Yeah, pick activities. I'm so glad to hear that you were having a youth engagement experience in your own high school. Great, thanks everyone. Brittany, if you wouldn't mind clearing that away and move into the next slide for me. Okay, so, and this can be for everyone, even if you put 4, but if you are more engaged as a student, so maybe you put 1, and if you could have been, if you could have said that you were 3 or 4, but if you were more engaged as a student, how might that have changed your physical education and physical activity experience? Now this time we're going to use that text box. So again, go up to View Options and go to your Annotate bar, and then you should have an option for text. You can type something in, and then when you click away, everyone's going to be able to see it. So I'm going to do this as well. So someone shared that they would have been more active. I shared, to be honest, that was me. I would have shared that I would have enjoyed PE more. More outdoor time. I can see Brittany writing that she would have paid more attention in PE class. More motivated. More knowledge to inform lifelong physical activity. Absolutely. More active. Thanks, Brittany. So yeah, this to me sounds very familiar to a lot of the things that we're hearing about when we work with partners around the country. So the experience of youth today is really largely the same. So, we have been talking with physical education and physical activity champions around the country, and youth engagement has been identified really as a crucial opportunity to build that culture of physical education and physical activity, and then also to cultivate youth buy-in to the approaches that are aimed at really impacting them. They're really the recipients of that. So thank you everyone for sharing your answers. Brittany, if you want to clear and go to the next slide. So with that framing, here are today's objectives for our webinar. So we're gonna, and thank you everyone for continuing to write in. Appreciate that. So I'm seeing people are saying they've been more active, more fun, been more motivated. That's great to see. So for today's session, we're hoping to achieve 3 things. First, we want to be able to define youth development and youth development outcomes, so really to provide that conceptual framework. Also talk about identifying levels of youth engagement and its forms, and then talking through some practical strategies about ways to increase youth engagement in PE, PA in schools. Next slide. So I've used the phrase build a culture of physical activity a few times, and so what does that mean? So all of our work, so all of Springboard to Active Schools work is really grounded in the Comprehensive School Physical Activity Program Framework, or CSPAP. And what CSPAP is, it really provides a framework for school districts and schools to support students in meeting that national recommendation of 60 minutes of physical activity every day. That's really our goal. We want to see students reaching that 60 minutes a day. And what this framework does is that it supports schools in identifying and leveraging all possible opportunities to get young people active. So not just in PE class, but outside of that as well. And beyond getting used to that, again, that target number of 60 minutes a day, CSPAP really helps to support students to develop the knowledge, skills, and confidence to be physically active for a lifetime. And so if you can look at your screen, the framework consists of 5 components. So there's physical education, which we consider to be the foundation of a CSPAP, physical activity during school, which includes things like recess and classroom physical activity, family and community engagement, staff involvement, and then physical activity before and after school. So taking a look at this, why are we even focusing on youth engagement and physical activity? So often when we talk about opportunities for physical activity through this framework, through a CSPAP, young people are really seen as the recipients of those activities. So for example, youth are the ones they're the physical education students, they're the ones playing at recess, they're participating in teacher-led classroom physical activity breaks. But less often we're talking about how youth can design and shape those activities and the physical activity programming in which they participate. And so they're really kind of seen as passive recipients rather than really active in this process and in this framework. So it's really notable to us that in the CSPAP framework, we have staff involvement and family and community engagement called out, but youth engagement and youth leadership is not really explicitly stated here. So today we really wanted to explore how we can engage youth in greater leadership through each component of this framework. I'm going to pass it to Brittany now.
Great, thanks so much, Kate. And so as I mentioned in my introduction, and for Kate and me, we have done some deep youth engagement and leadership cultivation in other areas of school health. So tobacco, substance use prevention, nutrition promotion, and peer leadership on topics ranging from HIV to bullying and violence, to name a few. And we've just really seen how youth leadership and engagement not only leads to better health outcomes, but it can also lead to other positive results like more widespread buy-in to strategies employed, greater relevance of program design, and also just an increased sense of ownership for outcomes, for youth outcomes for themselves and for their peers. And so school physical education and physical activity is one area of opportunity that we see for more intentional youth engagement. And especially, as Kate mentioned in our intros, during this time when we're all virtual, or not all, but many young people are engaging virtually, and they may not be able to engage with their peers, they may not be able to engage with the teachers in in-person ways, or they have to do it at a social distance. It's more important than ever to find ways for youth to really be engaged in their education and their educational experience. So this could look like choosing physical activity breaks to do in the classroom, to advocating for stronger physical education or physical activity policies in local school wellness policies. This could be engaging staff and families and community members in physical activity. There are lots of developmentally appropriate opportunities to engage youth from all grade levels to increase physical activity minutes overall through all components of a comprehensive school physical activity program. And so today we're going to explore how youth engagement can become a more explicit and routine part of how we design active school environments. So first, let's start with kind of the theory part. So we're going to talk about the youth development approach, which really underpins the youth engagement principles that we're going to share momentarily. And so this is kind of the quote unquote the why of youth engagement. So here we have another icebreaker, and so far you guys have been doing such a great job of engaging via stamping and annotating, and so now we're going to do something in the chat box. And so what I want you to do is just think about youth that you work with. This can be in the classroom, this can be youth that are in your life, whether it's your own young people that you live with or relatives and so on. And when you think about these young people, what are some of the outcomes that you might look for in them that might indicate that they are healthy and moving towards success? So how might they present? They might, in terms of traits, skills, attitudes, and whatnot. I'll just give you 30 seconds to put some ideas into the chat box. Right, great. I see involved with their community, how they're engaging with other students, having a positive attitude, confidence, respect for others, positivity, motivation, a belief in their future, that they're well-groomed and happy, good self-image, they believe in themselves, that they're having conversations about healthy nutrition, that they can talk about the issues that affect them. These are great answers, that they have friends, they're socially connected, they're confident, honesty and respect. Feel free to keep some of these answers coming. These are great thoughts. And so I agree with all of these. And so a lot of times when we talk about youth outcomes, they really hang out in this developmental outcomes space where a lot of what you all are putting in the chat box are, when we think of youth succeeding in the long term in their adult life, we want to see developmental outcomes like confidence, that they have leadership skills, that they respect one another and their environment, and so on. Yet, a lot of times when we talk about youth and when we design our schooling, when we design our public health programs, for example, we often are focused on the achievement and the prevention outcomes, which are also important too. So, you know, in school, we really focus on graduation. We focus on making sure young people can get a job, that they can, you know, do well in terms of grades and all of that. From the public health perspective, you know, we think about wanting to keep them from engaging in risk behaviors. We want to make sure that they are limiting their screen time and there's a list of things they should not be doing. But really, when we think about young people and what would really set them up for success, it's these developmental outcomes that really kind of give us some sense of confidence that the young people are on the path to leading a healthy and successful life. And so one way to get to these developmental outcomes really explicitly is by engaging youth in meaningful ways. And so let me just define what youth development is, and this is one definition that we use. It is an approach to supporting youth that focuses on outcomes necessary for adolescence and adult life based on their capacities, strengths, and formative needs. And I really appreciate this definition, especially because it really talks about, you know, kind of looking at that life course of, you know, focusing on a young person, as you see from the picture, from baby to adult, or to graduation and into adulthood. So we really have that forward-thinking notion of thinking about our young people that we work with. But also, it really speaks to how we need to build and invest in youth over time based on their current capacities, strengths, and formative needs. And so we're really meeting young people also where they're at. We're not expecting them to be over, you know, we're not expecting a third grader to be able to have the executive function of a 12th grader. We're meeting the third grader where they're at. I have a third grader, by the way, and I'm often meeting him where he's at, or trying to remind myself to meet him where he's at. But, you know, we really want to think about not only how do we engage them, but how do we engage them based on their capacities, their strengths, and their formative needs so that they can move forward in life well. And so then applying youth development to a comprehensive school physical activity program. So Kate and I often do trainings on making the case for increasing physical education and physical activity minutes in schools. And so often, you know, thinking back to the 3 columns of outcomes, achievement, prevention, and developmental, admittedly, we often focus on outcomes in the achievement column. We're like, physical activity can increase student concentration, on-task behaviors, and test scores. That's super important, and it really helps make the case, especially to school administrators, to really prioritize physical activity minutes in schools. We also often focus on the physical and social emotional health, so kind of some of those prevention outcomes. We recognize that by increasing physical activity minutes, we can decrease the prevalence of obesity by reducing the time that students are sedentary. We can reduce stress levels and anxiety by increasing motivation and enjoyment of learning. Also super, super important. And then going back to those developmental outcomes that we talked about as really being important, we can see a CSPAP as an opportunity to enhance youth development outcomes, like increasing youth confidence, improving youth organizational and leadership skills, giving young people a sense of responsibility for themselves and others, and empowering young people to create a culture of physical activity in their classroom or in their school or in their community to benefit not just themselves, but to benefit others. So there's a real opportunity if we reframe our thinking about the benefits of CSPAP to think through all 3 levels of outcomes to really see how youth engagement can be a key approach to doing that. So the youth development approach provides us with the rationale for why we should spend time thinking about youth engagement in a CSPAP. And so now let's talk about the how. Okay, so in this next section, we're going to really talk about what is youth engagement and what are the levels of youth engagement. So let's start with what youth engagement is. And I just think this slide is really, I really appreciate the definitions on this slide, and I have to give credit to the Society for Public Health Education's Engaging Youth Resources, where they talk about engaging youth in the WISC, the Whole School, Whole whole community, whole child model. And they offer these 3 definitions of youth engagement. The first definition comes from a researcher, the second comes from a 2nd grader, and the third comes from a high schooler. So what I'd love for you to do now is take a look at these 3 definitions and what are some of the common threads that you see through these 3 definitions. And you can go ahead and put some of those ideas in the chat box. What are some of the similarities that you see between these 3 quotes? So yeah, decision making, thanks Talia. That's definitely a thread that we see here. Any others? Adult engagement. Yeah, so this is not just youth doing their own thing, but there is engagement with adults and youth together. That they're involved and there's ownership in all caps, absolutely. Empowerment and shared power. And there's also individual buy-in. So we're not doing things for youth, but young people are really buying in, absolutely. There's empowerment again, youth input, youth involvement in decision making. Wonderful. These are all great answers. Thank you so much. And so what I saw as themes, yeah, empowerment is definitely a theme all throughout it. A number of you have put that, that's great. And so just the themes that I saw, kind of to the empowerment point, is youth engagement is about power. It's about the process of intentionally shifting some level of power, decision-making, and ownership to youth. So it's saying to youth that adults aren't the only ones who, quote unquote, know what's best, but actually that youth also have the opportunity to influence and decide and can be the experts to their own experience. The second theme I see in these definitions is about that youth engagement is about believing in youth. I really appreciate the 3rd bullet, the 3rd definition, because it highlights that youth are also given credibility. And yeah, Emma, it's about trusting young people. They're given credibility, that it's not just saying, oh, we'll give youth the power to make some decision, or we'll engage them, but who knows what's gonna happen. It's actually believing in young people. And youth engagement is a really it's meant to be a strengths-based approach, believing that youth not only should be able to influence the decisions that affect them, but that they are capable of doing so as well. And then finally, the third kind of theme that I'd offer is that youth engagement is meaningful. As we shift some level of power and decision-making to youth, and as we believe in their ability to contribute, we need to ensure that they're set up to meaningfully influence decisions, approaches, and their environments. So remembering back to the definition of the youth development approach, we need to engage youth based on their capacities, their strengths, and their formative needs. So by meeting youth where they're at and taking into account their readiness, we can then provide appropriate opportunities for engagement and build their capacity even further. So for example, I've kind of mentioned that I've worked with engaging young people in a number of realms in the public health sphere over the years. And I've worked on so many initiatives that have sought to engage, quote unquote, youth voice. They want a young person at the table, and that's a really good impulse. And so, for example, I've been asked to select and support youth to sit at the table with school and district and city leaders so that they could provide their perspective on a number of issues. But often in these situations, youth are only given 1 or 2 seats at the table amongst a table of very high-powered adults, which can be very intimidating even for the adults. So for a young person at that table, it can be a lot to take in. And the agenda often wouldn't be designed for their authentic engagement. It wasn't designed for them. And so when that happens, youth may have that literal seat at the table, but no actual voice at it because the space was not designed for them. So youth engagement really means understanding how to set young people up to meaningfully contribute and succeed. It's not just having them there, but it's actually thinking about what is the best way for them to be engaged. So in summary, youth engagement considers power, it's strengths-based, and it's meaningful. So why youth engagement, especially in the school space? And this is a quote by Michael Fullen in The New Meaning of Educational Change. And it says, when adults do think of students, they think of them as the potential beneficiaries of change. They rarely think of students as participants in a process of school change and organizational life. Now, not all schools are like this, but I would say, at least in my experience working with schools, working with young people, this is a pretty common theme that we see, that young people, the schools are designed thinking of young people as the beneficiaries of the services, of the supports that are being provided, but they're not always engaged in the process. And so this is an opportunity for growth, I think, in our field and change in terms of how we engage young people. So we've talked about how youth engagement benefits the youth that are engaged, as we talked about the youth development approach. But now I'm going to talk about the benefits of engaging youth in your CSPAP itself, or in creating that culture of physical education and physical activity. And there are 4 E's that I'm going to offer: equity and inclusion, effectiveness, engagement, and energy. So equity and inclusion, let's start with that one. So this is this quote, "Nothing about us without us," that stems from the disability rights movement, but it's been used in many social justice movements since. And the idea of this quote is saying that no policies or approaches should be decided without the participation of those who are affected by those policies and approaches. The full quote kind of gets to that 2 slides ago, as adults often think of students as beneficiaries rather than influencers. So youth engagement is more of an equitable and inclusive approach to designing and advancing a culture of school health, because efforts are done with youth, not just for youth. And so, you know, I think that's a philosophical underpinning. We really want to advance equity. But in addition to that, by engaging young people, we can hear from more diverse perspectives. So as mentioned, youth aren't often engaged in the decisions that affect them, and therefore engaging youth more intentionally brings their voice to the fore. And also, youth aren't monolith, right? Oftentimes we talk about youth voice as like one thing, but it's not. Just like adult voice isn't one thing. And so what might work for one group of youth may not widely be adopted by all. So engaging youth to solicit a wide range of feedback can help us really inform strategies that will be relevant to a greater proportion of your school population. And I just saw that someone raised their hand, but I would ask, since I don't think you can unmute yourself, go ahead and put the question in the chat box if you'd like to ask something. So also, from an equity and inclusion standpoint, engaging youth promotes trust between youth and adults, and it communicates to both youth, adults, and the community that youth voice is valued and sought out. And then also, the results of youth engagement in a CSPAP from an equity and inclusion perspective might mean, so just kind of practically speaking, what might that look like? It might look like physical activity during PE, recess, or in the classroom might be more inclusive of the culture or ability of a student. Youth might be able to engage with their family or caregivers of diverse linguistic and socioeconomic backgrounds to continue physical activity outside of the school day, so kind of extending beyond the classroom or the school. And then students will also feel more empowered to engage with staff to promote physical activity because they feel their voices are valued. The second E that I'd like to offer is that youth engagement promotes a more effective comprehensive school physical activity program. So youth engagement provides perspectives that adults might be missing, therefore resulting in programs, policies, and approaches that are more relevant and culturally appropriate. So for example, if youth are routinely and meaningfully engaged on a school health index team, the self-assessment process might yield insights on how youth are experiencing current physical education and physical activity programs and policies, and identify opportunities for meaningful improvement through the resultant school health improvement plan. Thirdly, youth engagement promotes engagement. So that sounds redundant, but just bear with me. Youth engagement really can result in greater engagement of youth in whatever you put forth. So when youth are engaged in shaping programs and decisions, they're more likely to be excited and bought into the results. And if youth are continuously engaged, real-time feedback and ideas can support efforts to continuously improve activities, programs, and policies. And as captured by the quote below, this is one of our colleagues in the state who works in the state of Colorado, especially, but I think all over. This can be particularly important at the secondary grade level. So let's be honest, as youth get older, youth are increasingly influenced by their peers. So as much as you're able to have youth influence, have them influence what sports are chosen. For example, a lot of you said that you were engaged in your physical education, physical activity environment by getting to choose what you participated in, by having youth being able to lead physical activity efforts, whether it's an energizer, an intramural sport, a fitness competition, or a PE lesson even. Youth engagement can lead to greater buy-in, not only for themselves, but also for their peers as well. And then finally, youth engagement in a CSPAP can infuse energy and creativity. So while a teacher might feel stuck doing the same old physical activity or lesson plan, youth can use their imaginations to come up with out-of-the-box alternatives. And that's something that I've seen in my work. Oftentimes things that I would have never thought of, young people would bring to the fore because they just have some of that out-of-the-box thinking. So that's the last kind of theme that I'd like to share about why it's important for your CSPAP to engage youth. Wonderful. So now, hopefully by now you're convinced of the value of engaging youth, both for the youth themselves, for their own developmental outcomes, but also for the benefit of promoting physical education and physical activity in schools. So now let's talk about what youth engagement looks like. And so I'm going to now pass the mic back to Kate.
Thanks, Brittany. So what you see in front of you is a diagram that depicts the levels of youth engagement. And just to give the citation, we adopted this from the Northern Ireland Youth Council. And so if you're taking a look at this, basically you can see as you move to the right of the continuum, the power of adults decreases while the power of youth increases, which we've been talking about that through this whole time. We want to see the power of youth increase. And so again, this is kind of a continuum, a way to think about this. Next slide. So now we're going to kind of do a deep dive into each of those different levels of youth engagement. So as we've talked throughout this webinar, when it comes to physical education and physical activity, youth are often seen as the recipients or the beneficiaries and not really seen as the influencers. I know we had some people who said that they were definitely engaged in PE and PA when they were in high school. That is amazing. But maybe for those of us that put 1 in terms of their involvement in the physical education and physical activity decision-making, for a lot of schools, they're in the none category. So youth really are not included. They don't have a voice. They don't have any power in that decision-making around youth engagement. So that's where we start with. We start with it at none. The next level is tokenism. So this is one step up from none, and this is where really adults set the agenda and make the decisions. But maybe they invite 1 or 2 young people to represent what we know is not a monolith, but that, quote, youth voice, and whom, they are inviting those 1 or 2 youth to the table, but they might not really have authentic influence in decision-making. So if we think back to that example that Brittany was sharing with us about kind of what she's been asked to do in the past, which is to bring 1 or 2 young people to the table, if a youth leader is invited to be on a school or a district task force to provide a youth perspective, but the meeting isn't really designed for them or they don't receive any context or support to engage, this might be considered tokenism. And while it's better than none, we want to reflect on that, this really isn't a meaningful way to engage youth. So the next level up is consultation. And this is where adults consult youth within adult parameters. I think that's a really important piece to add here, within adult parameters or within a specific context. So for example, youth might be asked to consult on a lesson plan or to choose a classroom physical activity from a list of possible options that an adult has come up with. Next slide. The next level is representation. So representation might include engaging a consistent team of youth leaders to sit on, we'll go back to that school health index team example. So there might be a team of youth leaders who are sitting on the school health index team to inform the assessment process and then any sort of improvement plan strategies that come from that. So maybe youth apply to be in these roles, or maybe they're selected by school leaders. So again, we're moving up from consultation. It's a great movement to kind of get more youth represented at the table. But to move along that continuation, participation really goes that step further from representation. So again, let's think about that school health index team example. Youth might actually develop and lead a separate youth-driven assessment of the physical education and physical activity environment to be considered in tandem with kind of the larger school health index process, and then to inform the final school health improvement plan strategies. And then the last level we see, which is what we're kind of always aiming towards, is self-managing. So self-managing is really where youth are working, as you can see on the slide, with little or no adult authority. So self-managing might be if youth advocates, and fundraise to start an intramural program or an activity club, something like a before school walking club. And with the approval of the school, the youth are really managing all aspects of the program or club. And that's really kind of where we're trying to get when we're thinking about the levels of youth engagement. So next slide. So another little activity for us, obviously, you know, we love the annotate bar at this point. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk through, I'm going to share with everyone a scenario. And I want you to think through kind of how we've defined these various levels of youth engagement. And I want you to use that annotate, so use that stamp again. So remember, you go up to view options and you can get your annotate bar. And I want you to indicate on this chart what level of youth engagement would you place the following scenarios. So here's the first one. So a classroom teacher asks one of their students to select the day's energizer from 3 options. So what level of youth engagement do you think that represents? So I'll share that scenario again. A classroom teacher asks one of their students to select the day's energizers from 3 options. And get everyone about 10, 15 seconds to put in your answer. So I'm seeing tokenism, some consultation. Okay, good answers coming through. Okay, so a lot around, I'm seeing kind of a mix between tokenism and consultation. For this one, I think tokenism absolutely speaks to this because we're talking about, you know, a teacher selecting just one student to kind of represent the voice of the whole class. We also consider this to be a consultation example. So adults are consulting with youth, but again, within adult parameters. So thanks so much, everyone. Brittany, do you mind clearing that out for me for our next example? Okay, so here's the next scenario. The physical education teachers, coaches, and one youth meet to plan the PE curriculum activities for the year. So I'll repeat that. The physical education teachers, coaches, and one youth meet to plan the PE curriculum activities for the year. So along this continuum, what level of youth engagement do we think we're seeing? Okay, seeing lots of different, some tokenism, some consultation, representation. Great, just another few seconds. Okay, so we kind of thought of this as a few different levels. So this could be tokenism. So if the youth doesn't really get to meaningfully influence the PE curriculum activities, I always go back to what Brittany was talking about meaningful engagement. I think that intent piece is really important. It could also be seen as consultation, especially if they're getting to lead some aspect of the work and make some meaningful change. And then for those of you who said representation, I think again, so, you know, we were talking about representation as youth are put forward by their peers. Maybe if that one youth was selected as kind of the voice for his or her classroom, that could be part of representation. So I think all these answers definitely hit that. Brittany, would you mind clearing the screen one more time? Okay, and then our last scenario. Youth leaders plan activities for and promote this year's Take Your Parents to PE Week. So I'll repeat that. Youth leaders plan activities for and promote this year's Take Your Parents to PE Week, which I think this year is called Bring PE to Your Parents Week. So be sure to look out for that coming up. Okay, so I see lots of people putting participation and self-managing. And Steve, great point about kind of depends on who that youth represents in the school. Exactly, I think it depends on who's putting that youth forward, kind of what's that intent behind that. Okay, just another few seconds on this one. Okay, so again, a lot of different types of answers, and I think a lot of this depends on the origins of this effort. So this could potentially fall in as something as consultation. It could be representation or participation, but I think self-managing as well, especially if youth are doing this work without adults or, with little or no adult authority. So, for example, if teachers identified the need to plan activities and asked students to plan selected activities and lead promotional efforts, this might be considered consultation since they're being asked to lead, but within a specific context. But let's say that youth were the ones, they identified the need to engage parents in PE to promote a culture of physical activity at home, and they really take it upon themselves to lead the planning and promotion with some adult support or maybe with little adult support. This could fall within participation and maybe even up to self-managing. So Brittany, you can clear that out for me. And thank you everyone for participating. So as we saw with this activity, it's not really clear cut where you might fall within the levels of youth engagement, but ultimately where your effort might fall in terms of this continuum depends on a few things. So first, how the effort originated. Was it the idea of youth or the idea of adults? That might depend on, that might affect kind of what level of engagement we're talking about. The second one is the extent to which youth are given power. Is it one youth among a lot of adults, or is there a strong group of youth working alongside adults who really represent other young people in their context? And then the third thing is how meaningful youth contributions are, or whether they are influencing decision-making in any way. Again, if they're kind of just there to fill a seat, that really goes down to tokenism, and we really want to see more engagement than that. So I really offer kind of three ways that you could use this continuum of youth engagement. So first, you could use it to explicitly consider how youth are being engaged whenever we're planning for them. So many times when we think about issues of equity and authentic engagement, it's important to make the implicit explicit. So rather than just going along with the status quo, we can at least intentionally name how youth are being engaged. So again, this is kind of around level setting. It's likely that classrooms, schools, and district decisions also often fall in the none category. And if that's the case, it's just important to acknowledge that and try to figure out ways that we can improve. And so that's really the second way that that Brittany and I are kind of thinking about how you could use this continuum, is thinking about ways you can really bump up your youth engagement. So going back to an earlier example that we just walked through, we said that having a meeting with PE teachers, coaches, and one youth to plan the PE curriculum for the year might be tokenism. So if it is, how might you bump up your youth engagement in that example? So how might you move up to consultation? So one way you could do that is by pulling together a youth advisory group to advise on these activities, so there's power in numbers. Okay, so now you're in consultation, you've pulled together this youth advisory group. How could you move up to representation? You might do that by having that youth advisory group receive training on curriculum development basics. They could inform broader parts of the curriculum or even facilitate curriculum activities that are developed with support from adults. So again, kind of thinking about this continuum as a way to move up, hopefully with the goal of reaching self-managing, but really kind of reaching any level that feels like a right fit for your work. And then the third way is that you can use this continuum to facilitate conversations, to really think about and assess the readiness of your organization to engage youth, and again, to make the implicit cultural or structural assumptions explicit. So at this point, we've talked about the levels of youth engagement, and now we want to kind of run through some practical strategies for youth engagement that you can consider. And hopefully a lot of these feel really intuitive. I think we've been using these words throughout our webinar. And so again, hopefully this feels really intuitive. So depending on the age, the developmental ability, or the contextual constraints, you might consider some or all of these forms when thinking about engaging youth. So we have 6 forms up on the screen: choosing, decision-making, planning, assessing, communicating, and implementing. So I'm going to run through these very quickly. So first is choosing. So again, making sure that young people have the opportunity to choose the activities that they participate in and how they wish to participate. Decision-making is another strategy. So having young people, or encouraging young people, or giving young people the space to meet regularly to discuss and modify policies, rules, procedures, anything around kind of that culture of physical education and physical activity in a school. Planning, so again, having young people are able to meet regularly to plan for future activities, games, curriculum, events, kind of whatever is happening around PE and PA in a school. Next slide. Assessing, so young people are able to give feedback and engage in any sort of evaluation activities of a program or how work is going in a school generally. So again, kind of I'm thinking about that school health index option. Communicating. So this is a great opportunity for young people to actually share what's going on in a school. So giving them the opportunity to present to school program, to present to outsiders. So school tours or to a school board, talks to community audiences, presentations to parents, funders, just being able to communicate outside of school, and then implementing. So young people can actually lead the activities and sports and engage their peers in meaningful discussions. So again, lots of different opportunities here to engage youth. And we call these forms of youth engagement, but these are really activities, strategies, you can kind of have a lot of different words for them. And truly, any of these forms are a great way to engage youth. Maybe you're a rock star and you're doing all 6 of these. Maybe, because you're working with elementary students, you're only doing 1 or 2 of these that feel like a really good fit for your school, your district, your community. And so with that, this actually leads into our last annotation activity. I want you to think through how I just described all these forms, and then imagine how you might engage elementary school children in PEPA. So think about, you're working with elementary school students. What form would be the best fit for getting elementary school children engaged in physical education and physical activity? So you can use that stamping on your annotate bar again to think through how might you imagine elementary school children being best engaged in PEPA. So choosing, absolutely agree, a great way for them to choose their own activities. See, communicating, yes, I feel like I'm most convinced when I see a young person sharing their own stories, especially an elementary school student, having an opportunity to practice speaking in front of adults. Decision-making, planning, really I'm seeing that elementary school students can be involved in any way, and that's an important point of this, is that as long as it's developmentally appropriate and feels like the right fit, really elementary, it doesn't matter if they're elementary, middle, or high school, really all these forms can fit in with everyone. So Brittany, do you mind clearing that up for me? And yes, Emma, kids usually have a lot to say. Yes, I have a 3-year-old at home, and I can confirm he definitely has a lot to say and would have a lot to say about how he's able to move his body at school too. So to close, I'd love for as many of you as possible to share in the chat box one way that you want to try to incorporate one of these forms of youth engagement into some aspect of physical education or physical activity within your own context. And if you don't directly work in physical education or physical activity, you can also share one way that you want to try to incorporate one of these forms in your context generally. So use the chat box and share kind of one way that you might take away some of these forms in your own work. Just give everyone a minute to reflect here. So I see planning, practice what I preach. Sometimes that's harder, I know for sure. Assessing, incorporating youth in planning, love to hear that. Engage youth in planning a social marketing campaign to increase physical activity. I think that's fabulous. Add a slide about student voice to the professional development that I provide for schools. I know you can sometimes be guilty about that we just have a training and we don't include anything about youth voice in there. Assessing and incorporating youth in that assessment, planning based on needs, giving choices, youth planning. Yes, I love to hear all these. Overall in grant work that I do with schools and districts, do a better job overall incorporating youth in the process, and especially from the design level. Absolutely agree. And that's kind of the point of today's webinar, to really spark thinking about that from the very beginning. So providing options and it's about what physical activity would be most appropriate and have the most interest by kids. Involve legislators, absolutely. And I think especially in this time of COVID-19, where a lot of teachers are doing this work virtually, keeping students and young people engaged through physical activity and providing them those options is so hugely important. So thank you so much, everyone, for participating in this. I love to hear all this. Brittany, I'm going to pass it back to you.
Thanks so much, Kate, and all of you have been such wonderful participants. Thank you for making our conversation rich in this hour. So just in summary, these are just core principles to keep in mind to engage youth. Listen to young people and really make space to listen. And a part of that is also to stop yourself from taking over. As an adult, it can be tempting to try and step in for youth in the spirit of helping and guiding. But again, you want to create space for youth, and that might mean giving them more space and time while supporting them along the way. You want to encourage opportunities for leadership and really intentionally think about how you can shift some decision-making power over to young people. We want to not only remember to make youth engagement meaningful, we want to remember to make youth engagement meaningful. And so that means we need to provide the opportunities as well as training, support, and practical resources. We hold high expectations for youth while also being understanding and patient. Sometimes the processes may not go the way that we might be used to, and that's okay. That is part of the fun, the energy and creativity that can come with engaging youth. And also just to be authentic as you engage with youth. Relationships and trust are key to youth engagement. And finally, have fun. As someone who's worked with high school youth for years, and as someone who gets to hang out with elementary school youth in my daily life at home, there's never a dull moment, and the creativity and the energy can be really boundless. So I just want to thank you once again for joining us today, and I just want to share that Springboard to Active Schools will be releasing a couple of new resources in the fall. The first will be a classroom physical activity resource during COVID-19. That'll be released in mid-October, and we're currently taking the concepts that we talked about in today's webinar, and we're going to be putting those into youth engagement resources as well, hoping for a late fall release. So please stay tuned. And so with that, I just want to thank you for your time. I know we're running short on time, so I'm going to pass back over to Caitlin and Steve to round us out and close our webinar. Thank you so much.
So I see someone has asked if the presentation will be available after the webinar. We will be posting the presentation slides and recording on our website. And all attendees will also get a follow-up email within the next day that will include those resources as well as the evaluation for anyone who is seeking continuing education, or just to let us know what you thought of today's presentation.
Sorry, I was muted. So thank you, Caitlin. And here's the information on continuing education. So if you would like to get some continuing education for attending this webinar, the information is provided right here. And you can go to the ASHA website. Also, we have a couple upcoming webinars. On the 14th, strategic planning process to create comprehensive health and wellness plans. And on November 10th, integrating physical activity into the classroom, practical strategies for all health leaders. And here is the website if you're interested in finding out more about ASHA. And I would like to just say real quickly, I really appreciated everything that you had to say, Brittany and Kate. It was awesome. And I do some work in regard to happiness, and everything you were saying there, that's the foundation of helping people develop a happy, healthy life. They have to see meaning. They have to see some control. They have to be able to set goals and be active, and everything you talked about was just awesome. So I would really like to say thank you so much for a great job. And I'd also like to thank everybody for attending.
Yeah, and if you enjoyed today's webinar, Brittany and Kate will be presenting again on the webinar in November. So stay tuned for the registration link to go up. All right, with that, we're done for the day. So thank you again for joining. Thank you, Brittany, Steve, and Kate as well.
Yes, thanks to everybody. Great job, Caitlin.
Have a good one.
You too, thanks.